Welcome to the Learn By podcast. I'm Valentina.
And I'm Renee.
And together we talk about practical tips and tools for teachers around formative action and other effective pedagogy. We try to keep it short
and brief.
Anything we mention you can find in the show notes. Want to know more about what we do? Check out our website, formativeaction.com, where you can find our book, blogs, and online courses. Welcome to this Learn Bites episode. In this episode, we're going to talk about feedback and why feedback is often such a frustrational practice. So sometimes you feel that it's more work than it's worth, or you are putting in way more effort than your students. And sometimes you feel that it takes so much time to organize feedback and to give feedback. If you feel this way, then this episode is for you. In this episode, we are discussing different causes why feedback often doesn't work and how you can organize feedback in such a way that it's effective and that students have to do the work.
From research, we know that there are a lot of issues with feedback. And the first issue that we are aware of is that students have a lack of shared sense for quality. So what we discussed in the previous episodes, that it's very important to talk to your students about what the goal looks like, and so that they can develop a sense for quality. And when they don't have a sense for quality, they'll find it a lot harder to give each other feedback and also to receive feedback because they just don't know what they're giving feedback on. So that's a very common issue that we find in classrooms, is that students have a lack of, and therefore are not very good at this entire feedback practice.
The second thing is that we as teachers are inclined to give way too much feedback. So we create a feedback overload. And when we give too much feedback at once towards a student or to organize it for a student, the student can become overwhelmed, preventing them from focusing on the most critical areas and increasing the risk of just doing nothing with the feedback, because it's like, I don't know where to start, I cannot do this. Students will feel very helpless. So this is a risk and a reason why feedback often fails.
Yeah, the third reason is sort of an extension to that second issue, and that is that as teachers, we know, of course, that too much feedback is not a good thing. And then we chop it up into little pieces. But then we wind up giving something that is called sat-nav feedback. It's where we continuously give directions to students on how to get to the target. So, and in that way, we also keep our students helpless because they keep relying on us as a navigator. Well, actually, you want your students to be able to become more independent and more able for themselves to reach the goal.
And the fourth thing is, and that is a very important reason, is that if there's no landing space, so if there's no room for the student to reflect and to act upon the feedback, then the feedback is not effective. Then feedback is just received and maybe it's even thrown away, but the student will not act upon it. And that's the whole reason why we give feedback, is that it's information that the student needs to act upon. And this aspect, we will come back later on this aspect in the episode because it's incredibly important. What we also need to talk about is shifting the paradigm of feedback. Traditionally, we think of feedback in terms of how it's delivered, how to say it correctly, often packaging a positive comment before a negative one. However, the shift proposed here is look at feedback from the perspective of the receiver, not just the sender. Success in feedback is not necessarily about how it's framed, but how the receiver processes and uses it.
So in our book, we have a new definition on good feedback. And that is that feedback is information that you receive that makes you think before you act on it. So by framing feedback that way, it becomes very clear that feedback is not about what you did in the past, or it could be about what is in the past, but it's also always about what you want to do in the future or what you're going to do in the future. And ideally, what you do is you organize the feedback as a teacher in such a way is that it makes your students think about what they did in the past in order to do better in the future, or you make them think about what others did in the past, for example, by looking at exemplars, and then using that thinking to improve their acting in the future. So these are all great examples of how you would make your students think by organizing feedback. But of course, it's very important to make your students act on that thinking. So they always need a landing space, as we call it, which is either a new assignment or a retry or try to repair something that they did. And that is very important in order to see what your students have thought about. So you want to make them think about something, but of course you're never entirely sure about what they'll actually think about. So seeing them put their thinking into action actually gives you feedback on how well the organizing of the feedback went.
Okay, here are some questions to check for yourself if you understood the key concepts of this episode. The first question: which of the reasons that we talked about in the beginning of this episode do you find yourself guilty of?
What is the definition of effective feedback?
Why talk about organizing feedback instead of giving feedback?
What is a landing space? Thank you for listening. Until the next time.